As the program mentions, I'm completing a book now, which is a kind of a survey or a presentation of Jewish religion. But the main argument I offer is that we are at the beginning of a major new age in Jewish history. After 2,000 years of powerlessness, of exile, of living on the sufferance of others, the entire Jewish people is united now in seeking to take power, to achieve not only sovereignty, but life and dignity and security. And this is a fundamental transformation of Jewish civilization and of the Jewish future. I'd like to briefly with you, if you will give me 10 minutes of attention, share what I consider to be 10 or maybe the next 9 ideas as to how we take this period of transformation and make sure that it succeeds to assure the future of the Jewish people. And of course, the first obvious point is, why this change now? Why are we striving for power now in Jewish history? And the answer, of course, is because we have learned the lesson of the Holocaust, the greatest tragedy, catastrophe of Jewish history, and an unprecedented genocide in human history. What we learned in the Holocaust was very simple. On the one hand, the culture we live in, modern culture, postmodern, has created incredible power concentrations, military, technological, transportation, you name it. And while many of the results are constructive, when this power is brought together, centralized and controlled by evil people, it can inflict damage without limit. And the second thing we learned from the Holocaust is that it was our powerlessness that enabled it to go unchecked. The Jewish people did not have a government or an army to protect it. It did have a country of haven to offer security and escape. The neighbors of the Jewish people were at best bystanders and in many cases actively collaborated in their destruction. And even the Allies, supposedly fighting a war to save democracy, did very little to protect the Jewish people. And so we came to a very simple understanding that we cannot have a life, we cannot have a future without taking power, without having the ability in our own hands to assure our own life and dignity and security. And incidentally, it's not just the Jewish people who learned that lesson, but if you look at human history in the last 3 decades, the whole third world, all groups that were either victimized or subject to oppression, women, gay people, African Americans, you name it, came to realize that unless they have the power to protect themselves, there is no limit to their victimhood. And so I argue that this is the central challenge of our life as Jews and as a community, to develop a replacement for the ethics of powerlessness which we have practiced for 2,000 years, to develop an ethic of power. And the ethic of power has 2 components. One is, how do we get enough power, enough strength to defend ourselves in a very tough world? To give one example, the state of Israel, which has had to develop, to protect itself, the 4th strongest army in the world. This is a people that did not know how to fight, that did not understand what a soldier and army represents for 2,000 years. But it's had to develop that skill. And of course, Israel can't do it alone. It needs support, it needs strengthening. So half of the ethic is just, how do you get political power? How do you get economic? How do you get military power? And the second half is, once you have that power, how do you exercise it fairly and justly and wisely? Because again, the truth is that power is corrupt. And when you're practicing power in the real world, there's a constant dynamic challenge to have enough and to do it without overdoing, to do it without destroying, without becoming corrupted. And that's what the Jewish people taught the whole world. That might does not make right. That power has to be used properly, effectively, fairly, and that is a challenge, an ongoing challenge, which will take the input and the balanced judgment of every type of Jew and every kind of background. Which brings me to the 4th idea. Brings me to the fourth idea. Russian Jewry itself is a living example of the advantage of shifting from an ethic of powerlessness to an ethic of power. For centuries, Russian Jews lived under the Tsar, under persecution, discrimination. You never confront the authorities. And under Stalin and his successors, you never confront the authorities. You accept everything, the discrimination, the persecution, the occasional pogrom, and you adapt to that reality. But when Israel was born, and in particular in 1967, after that remarkable victory, Russian Jewry revolted. It came to understand the model of Israel was the Jewish people taking power, and they understood it was their time, or at least their activists understood, it was their time to confront the authorities. And confront them they did. Not only demanding to be treated as equal, but if not, to be given the right to go home to their homeland, where they would be given the full dignity and their full rights. And in the case of such heroes as Natan Sharansky, they deliberately and openly linked the Jewish demand for proper treatment with the claim and the right of freedom and free immigration to everybody. In the Sharansky-Sakharov link, the entire system of despotism and Stalinism was confronted by the Jewish people. Now, the Russian Jews couldn't have done it alone. World Jewry, American Jewry in particular, had to organize and demonstrate. And we had to recruit the American government and the European governments. And the American government, in part because of the Cold War, nevertheless came out on our side. And the Jackson-Vanik Amendment connected Jewish immigration to Russian commercial needs and economic needs. And the truth is, because we held fast and confronted, we not only won this amazing redemption and renewal of Russian Jewry, a Jewry that was slated for oblivion and inescapable assimilation, was freed, allowed to go hundreds of thousands to America, 1 million to the state of Israel, and to renew its life in Russia. And an important lesson we learned from that is not only that power and confrontation works better than powerlessness, we also learned that when Jews stand out for their own rights, when they protect their own cause, they also bring a blessing not only for themselves, but for the rest of humanity too. And while the system of Russia is far from perfect, the truth is that the post-Stalinist system collapsed in no small measure because the Jewish community defied successfully the reign of fear and tyranny. And so it's a kind of a living lesson that we have to learn to take that power and take those risks because of the blessing for ourselves and for others. Which brings me, of course, to the central point about Jewish power in this era. The primary expression of that Jewish power, of course, is the state of Israel. And that's because in the state of Israel, the Jewish majority votes and decides policy. And because in the state of Israel, Jewish values, Jewish culture, the Bible, Jewish ethics set the framework of values that guide the exercise of power. And so, of course, it's the primary expression of the Jewish attempt to gain power, enough power to live and to survive and to flourish. But again, Israel cannot do it alone, never could do it alone. It not only needs the support of the diaspora Jewry, it needs our help in recruiting allies. Without the allies, Israel would not have made it, whether it was the French and British in the 50s and 60s, or whether it was the America, which has become the indispensable ally down to this day. So again, in taking power, we cannot do it alone. Israel cannot do it alone. It needs the feedback of American Jewry. It needs the support. It needs the balance. It needs the perspective and the capacity to recruit, in which 2% of the American population has successfully represented Israel and helped it recruit the full-hearted, overwhelming support of the American people in this continuous struggle. Which brings me to the sixth point I wanted to make. And we all have to understand that not everybody gets it. Not everybody gets it. It's a challenge. It's an ethic that is only developing now. It's not self-evident. and not everybody gets it. I give you one example, the Haredi religious community, both in Russia and in Israel, which not only did not understand the importance of a Jewish state, but having won the Jewish state, now claims the right to be exempt from the army on the grounds they don't have to serve in the army because if they practice their religion, God will protect the Jewish people. Well, that is, of course, a flagrant misunderstanding of history, and I believe of God's will also, because in fact, without the army, Israel would have been destroyed a long time ago. So the very and Russian Jews, Russian immigrants, even those whose religion, whose Jewishness they deny, and whose conversion they resist and make difficult, serve in the army and give their lives and have given Israel this amazing strength to win victory after victory in that very rough neighborhood. And then, so we have an unfinished job to persuade, to get across the message to every Jew that one has to take power. I'll give another example, which again I think Russian Jews can make a very special contribution to. American Jewry, which has got the message to some extent, which has learned from the 50s and 60s when AIPAC was a small mom-and-pop operation to become the most powerful lobby in Washington. American Jewry, which has learned the challenge of taking power, also is still not quite there and needs a lot of help. I'll give one example. American Jews are roughly 80% liberal left in their political and their voting patterns. Again, as a practicing liberal, although as I was telling Ron Tarosian, I was mugged by reality, so I've heard some of my lessons. Anybody who understands the ethical power understands that it's not healthy for any people to be totally in any one party or one side. It's just not the reality, because in a democracy there will be a shift of administration, there will be exchange of parties, and therefore it's healthy when each community develops a balance so that there's a left and a right, so that there is an influence and a prestige and a power accession, no matter which group is in power. That whole lesson of learning, and again, one of the important contributions that Russian Jews can make, is that having tasted the oppression and having met real evil people who would not be stopped without confrontation and without force, Russian Jews are more balanced politically, maybe not fully balanced, but they're a corrective to the total Jewish community, and part of the task we have to do together is to learn from each other and to strengthen each other and to get the message across that Israel is supported from the right and from the left, that Israel is a bipartisan issue, that the challenge of exercising power fairly and justly is shared by all American Jews, and where it's a dynamic process in which we learn and balance each other. So that's another dimension of this contribution that we have to make together, and have to educate all of American Jews to understand that an ethic of power takes maturity, takes not one-sided investment politically or any other way, takes a constant dynamic willingness to exchange and to learn and to grow and to balance together. Now, I come back to the question, the good news is that the majority of Jews do understand this transformation. But the majority of American Jews, as the majority, overwhelming majority of Russian Jews, do understand that Israel is not just an ally, not just a needed cause, that it is, in a very real sense, what the classic Jewish tradition calls Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations, that it is not just an ally to be helped, but it gives back. It is not just a trading partner, but a major creative force for a better future. And I give you the obvious examples in which Israel is literally the standard of the world, which needs to be understood and taught to the world too. And I start, of course, with the economy. Israel, this is one of the great accomplishments of its 70 years, starting with a socialist and collective culture and tradition, a successful one that built the state of Israel, but could not generate the power of growth and of a free market, transformed itself into a free marketplace and into a major startup creative nation. That a country that started with no natural resources and poverty has built this amazing startup nation tradition and creation, that the Israel GDP has growth has gone 1,500% in the last 70 years. It's one of the most remarkable growth stories economically and generating prosperity. Not that its problems are finished, but it is a model for other nations, particularly in the rest of the developing world. Second example, of course, is military. Again, we started as a people which never had soldiers, which never understood the role of an army. And the truth is, in 1948, when Israel was declared, it had almost no artillery. It had a handful of tanks. It had 3 airplanes that it bought secondhand from Czechoslovakia, and they arrived in the middle of the war. So a country that barely survived that war, that lost 1% of its population. The equivalent today in America would be a war in which we lose 3.5 million people. It lost 1%, but it made it. But it understood that it must develop militarily. And since then it has become literally the leader. It takes the most advanced fighters in the world, the F-35, and improves them with its electronics and its avionics. That it has become the world leader in cyber, both warfare and defense. That it has become the most creative and powerful force of defense. Iron Dome, the development of anti-missile. It is literally not only the leader, but has been able to help America and other allies begin to catch up to the missile threat. And 2 other examples too politically. One is, how do you treat your minorities? The truth is, here again, look at the Christian religious minority in Israel. Israel is the only country where there is religious freedom and government support and a respectful attitude. It is the one Christian community in the whole Middle East that is still growing. In every other country in the Middle East, Christianity, where it originated and where it was dominant, has now shrunk, and in many of these countries faces a disappearing future. So how do you treat your minorities? I want to give the Arab example, if I may. And people often overlook this. Despite 70 years of terror, despite a constant surrounding by Arab nations threatening to destroy Israel, the Arab minority of Israel has gone from military government in 1948, was not yet trusted, they would be willing to be citizens of the country, to steadily greater involvement, now full participation in Israeli life. The Arab population has now become the wealthiest, average income, I should say, of the Arab country in the Middle East, the highest educational levels, and the highest, the most life expectancy growth. All that, even though there's not full equality yet, and even though there is serious difficulties, including the difficulty of their own Knesset leaders representing them very poorly and really acting ambivalently, if not hostilely sometimes, to the state of Israel. But as a model of how do you deal with your minorities, Israel is the model for the world. And I give the last example, of course, immigration. This problem which has now torn apart the whole world, which has led Western Europe to crisis. There are the extremes. There are the French situation where you have unchecked immigration, and suddenly the Muslim community of immigrants is no longer integrated. It's separated, it's segregated, it struggles with crime, it struggles with unadjusted values, many of which are in conflict with French values. So you have here where immigration becomes a threat that rips apart the culture and the fabric of the country. Similar patterns in many parts of Europe. The alternative, of course, is, even in America, a country that has flourished from immigration, people threatened or afraid of these developments begin to speak of total exclusion or closing down immigration. Israel model, I think, is much more relevant and much more. What Israel said was the opposite. Immigrants are a source of dynamic strength, creative, demographic strength. We will take and guarantee, in fact, the dignity and life of every Jew. And Israel, 600,000 Israelis took in 650, 700,000 Arab Jews and gave them a new life, a new equality, and new dignity. It took in 1 million Russian Jews, you know. It took in 150,000 Ethiopian Jews. In short, it takes them in, and without pressure and respecting their culture. And there is a whole culture and tradition of enrichment in the Russian speaking as well. At the same time, integrates them. So that over a period of generations, they become fully equal and fully participatory. And they make a major contribution. This is a model for how you handle immigration that the rest of the world has to catch up to. Well, so you'll ask me, if so, why is Israel so under attack or isolated? Why at the UN is it constantly attacked? Well, again, we know the answer, and that's part of our challenge to defend and to articulate. That part of it is anti-Semitism. There is still this idea that the one people who are not entitled to their own country are Jews, and they deny the right of Israel to exist. There is the inner crisis and corruption of Islam, which is going through a major failed modernization crisis. And instead of coping with its own internal development and needs, took the easy path, that is to say, the sick path, of demonizing Israel and blaming all its problems on Israel. And you might say again that it's the disrespect for Israel that reflects the inner crisis of Islam, and that our task is to help the healthy forces and to hang in there and work to maintain our own security until those healthy forces reassert themselves. And of course, the third reason why Israel is often attacked and isolated is the crisis of the left, and the radical left, I speak in particular, which has lost its moral way, which treats people, ex-colonials, or people they perceive as victims, and they can do no wrong, does not hold them to account morally when they're doing the wrong thing, when they have gone on a path of terror or on a path of victimization and denial. We treat politically correctly instead of challenging morally. So this is something which is not Israel's problem. It's a challenge and a crisis for all liberals and all left to correct this rot in the radical left, which otherwise threatens to undermine their own strength and their own standing. And last but not least, and I want to concede that's part of our challenge, there is this problem that frequently the ethic of powerlessness is used to judge Israel instead of the ethic of power. And I give you the obvious case we all know, and that is civilian deaths. Now, when you are ethically powerless, when you have no army, you will never cause a civilian death. It's a very fine state of purity. The only catch, of course, is that you're powerless, and therefore you cannot protect yourself. The minute you choose to have an army, the minute you choose to self-defend, there will be inescapably civilian death. So what's the measure of a moral army? The measure, of course, is how few and how do you achieve that? Richard Kemp, the head of the British Army in Afghanistan, gave this testimony 2 years ago, which remains still the central truth of the whole story. He said, very simply, that by an all-out superhuman effort, the Americans and the British, the Allies, brought civilian deaths down to a ratio of 3 to 1 for soldier fighters that you were fighting. He said it was very hard because they were embedded in the civilian population, but we brought it down to 3 to 1, and this was the highest and the best accomplishment as far as we know in military history. But in Gaza in 2014, Israel brought the ratio down to 1 to 1. An astonishing accomplishment, doubly so because the Hamas systematically embeds its soldiers, its fighters, its installations in civilian territory, which had raised a higher level of destruction. And I want to point out to you that on May 14th, with all the press coverage of the 62 deaths in Gaza, it turns out that of the 62 dead, 50 Hamas now admits were Hamas members, and 3 by Islamic Jihad. In short, Israel is a model of how a moral army restrains itself and in self-defense does what has to be done, but has been able by extraordinary efforts and creativity to minimize civilian casualties. And that is the moral equivalence that is not understood, which is our task to teach the world, and to articulate and to defend. And I want to just finish with a simple comment of one other point too. In order to do this, in order to educate our fellow Jews on what are the responsibilities of an ethic of power, how do you deal with the inescapable compromises that you have to make in order to function in a real world? How do you make sure you don't get corrupted by power? My answer is that all Jews have to cooperate together. We have to develop a language of discourse so that we argue together, so that we try to get a balance. And the truth is, to get that balance, we need the left and the right to balance each other. We need the hard-nosed realism and the strength of force that the right knows how to use, which has almost had a catastrophic failure in foreign policy because America was, under President Obama, was afraid to use that force, or threatening to use that force to get Iran to step back down. So we need that push from the right that understands the use of power and the use of force, balanced by the desire to not crush, the desire to find a peaceful way, the desire to recognize the rights and the needs of everybody, to make room for the other's dignity. We need that constant feedback from each other. We need a debate that reflects respectfully upon each other. And I want to take an example, frankly, because I know it'll be controversial. But again, to me, this is part of the challenge of developing our language together. I want to take the New Israel Fund as a case study. It specializes in trying to strengthen democracy in Israel. And I think it has been able to help marginalized groups in Israel, such as women, such as gay, such as the Arab population. But in the very process of trying to help those groups, it has not always hit the right note or the right limit or the right boundary. And some of its own fringe beneficiaries got involved with BDS and got involved with it. Again, my answer is, how do you deal with this challenge? And my answer is, you have a dialogue, you criticize, you challenge. What I think doesn't work is simply to dismiss or to delegitimate one or the other, so that the press, left press, tries to turn Bibi Netanyahu into a demon, and the right press tries to turn everybody else into traitors. What we need to develop is an ethic of power in which we can learn from each other, in which we correct each other, in which we criticize the mistakes of each other, and try to do better the next time around. I think this is an unfinished challenge. You know, the Talmud, finish with that Talmud, the Talmud says, if you study the Jewish tradition Talmud, every law and every truth, when you ask what's the answer, it's a disagreement between two rabbis. You don't have one position, you have machloket, it's called disagreement on almost every law and every case. So the Talmud asks, are these disagreements, are these fights, are they good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? And you know what the Talmud's answer is? It all depends on how you fight. Talmud says, machloket l'shem shamayim, if you fight for the sake of heaven. What does that mean? It means you argue because you want to get closer to the truth. You argue because you want to have a balanced policy that doesn't overdo strength and doesn't underuse strength, that doesn't abuse minorities and doesn't pander to them. To get that, you need machloket, you need disagreement. A disagreement of that sort is a blessing. A disagreement that seeks to demolish the other side, to delegitimate them, to say they don't have the right to exist, is destructive. So that's our challenge. Together, right and left, Russian, American born, Russian speaking, Hebrew speaking, English speaking, we have to learn and listen from each other and work together to reach the entire American population with this understanding. So the truth is, the stakes have never been higher. If we fail, God forbid, Israel could itself be destroyed by Iran if we are not strong enough. If we fail, God forbid, life in Europe could become unlivable for Jewish communities. There's a threat of that already. If we fail in America, assimilation and disappearance could be our fate. If we succeed, if we work together, if we can match the incredible creativity already shown by our people in Israel and America, if we can match that, then we can have a renaissance, we can have a rebirth of Jewish life. This will turn out to be one of the great periods of Jewish growth, Jewish achievement, Jewish success, and yes, Jewish power. Churchill, speaking in the depths of despair in 1941, said to his people, "I not only have trust and faith in you that you will rise to the occasion, I believe you are capable of the highest level of support, steadfastness, and creativity. So people will look back and say, this was their finest hour." I think we have this capacity, and we have to work together, that we can rise to that level, which Israel has shown all of us already. And when we rise to that level, people will look back 100 years from now and say, this was their finest hour.